what I want to do today is, I'll tell you in a second. I've had lots of support, and lots of colleagues have contributed to the stuff I've done. So that's a brief acknowledgement, because I probably won't get to the end of all my slides because I tend to rabbit on a bit. So just excuse me. What I want to do briefly, just recognise the enormous progress we've made in tobacco control. In countries like Australia, we've reduced the smoking prevalence by almost 2/3 from what it was in the early 1980s, when people started to take tobacco control seriously. But there's still a huge amount to do. There's about 600 people an hour dying of smoking worldwide. That means every few seconds somebody's dying. We won't count them as we go through the presentation. Get a bit disruptive. And the other thing that's emerging, and isn't so much the case in developing countries, but very much the case in developed countries, is increasingly becoming an issue of disadvantage. So tobacco control is probably one of the most effective things you can do if you're working to reduce the levels of disadvantage among the most disadvantaged sectors of the community. I also want to go on and argue a little bit that a pure social constructivist approach, which has dominated tobacco control over the last 20 or 30 years, is an inadequate model. It's not a wrong model. It's partially correct, but it's inadequate, and we need to integrate that with a more biopsychosocial model. And in that context, that harm reduction is important, and that vapourised nicotine products, which aka e-cigarettes, are the most promising means, although in the last few days there's been a lot of publicity around a product Philip Morris has brought out called e-cigs, which Philip Morris claim is going to just take over the world and make their investors extremely rich. It's a bit like it's a heated tobacco product rather than a burnt one, and I won't talk terribly much about that in the presentation, but I'm happy to talk about it after in question time. I think there are and I'll go through this, far less downsides than people think around a harm reduction approach to tobacco control, and in my view it's the only viable model we have for an effective end game for smoked tobacco. Most people, when they talk about an end game for smoked tobacco, say getting the prevalence down to less than 5%. I think that's unimaginative, and I think we should be getting the prevalence of regular daily use down to well under 1% before we can say we've actually largely solved the problem and have a residual problem we can manage. So the broad model which we've been operating is basically that we can educate people, support and facilitate change, which we've done a lot of. We can do some things around controlling the tobacco industry. We've done very little, though, on product features. The price has been a major influence in tobacco control over the certainly since the mid-1990s, when the World Bank pointed out the importance of price in tobacco control and convinced people. And now it's become de rigueur to put the price of cigarettes up. In Australia at the moment, the price, a single cigarette costs around $1. And the Australian dollar is in approximate parity with the Canadian dollar. So they've become much more expensive. And that has been driving down consumption, but there are issues at the bottom of among the very poor that haven't been adequately addressed. Places of sale has also been largely ignored. Cigarettes is probably still the most available consumer product anywhere, and promotion has been, in the case of Australia, largely eliminated. The only forms of promotion still are a dirty olive green pack with the name of the product on it. Where do I push the button here? Oops, doesn't want the. Try going that one. Just wanted to point out over the last 20 years or so that the prevalence of smoking in Australia, and Canada's probably fairly similar, has been declining. But in Australia, since this century, the entire reduction in smoking prevalence is due to an increase in the proportion of people who report never having been regular smokers. So the proportion of ex-smokers has remained the same. So we haven't become more successful in getting people to become established smokers to quit. We've become more successful by stopping young people taking up smoking. And in Australia, that's been achieved almost entirely by directing our campaigns at encouraging existing smokers to quit and telling existing smokers about the harms of smoking. Kids are bright. If you try and target stuff at them, they always think it's directed at younger kids. And they don't like being targeted when adults aren't being targeted. So by having credible campaigns directed at adults, we're actually able to get smoking rates down in kids. No, it's going to work. No. Technology's defeated us. So after 30, Australia, Victoria, where I'm from, has had a television-based quit campaign every year since 1985. So now over 30 years, using the most sophisticated techniques available. We developed and were the first place in the world really to systematically use mass media as a way of educating the public about tobacco control. We've used some of the most sophisticated techniques available. We've eliminated the promotion of the product from the point where it was totally socially accepted. It's now a non-socially accepted behaviour. And yet we still have a lot of people continuing to smoke. And still, about 1 in 5 young people taking up smoking. Used to be 1 in 2 took up smoking when I started 30 years ago, but it's now 1 in 5. That's a massive improvement. But why, in the context of this product being so socially denormalised, are so many people taking it up? And part of the solution is that nicotine actually is quite an attractive pharmacological aid for many people. Some people don't like it, and they don't tend to become smokers. Some people, it does something for them that they really enjoy, and we tend to ignore that in tobacco control. We like to demonise the stuff and say it's all bad. The other thing about it is chronic relapsing condition. The average smoker makes at least 2 failed quit attempts a year. This is based on retrospective reports from the previous month. So about 10% of people report having made a quit attempt in the previous month. That goes up to 1.2 quit attempts a year. And they also report about the same number of aborted attempts. That is, they made a commitment that they were going to quit and they didn't get to 24 hours for some reason or other. Perhaps they woke up the next morning and had had 3 cigarettes before they realised that they were going to quit, or got to 11 o'clock and thought, I can't stand it any longer. However, most smokers have survived for a month or more. Well over 2/3 of smokers have managed to quit smoking for a month or more. They've gone through the hard stuff and they're back smoking. There's something about that allure that's drawing people back. My estimate is, and this is more back of the envelope estimate, is that around 40% of those people who get to the age of 30 or 40 and are a regular smoker will never successfully quit except using the terminal method, which is 100% successful. Recent quit attempts predict failure. These learning-based models that, the more you try, the better you get at it. No, if you've made a recent quit attempt, you're much more likely to fail. One of the things about this is we've asked people how much they want to quit. We've asked a whole range of motivational questions that anybody who's got a background in psychology would recognise. all of them predict making quit attempts in the expected direction. Pretty much all of them predict failure among those who've tried in the opposite direction. The better they are at predicting trying, the better they are at predicting failure in the opposite direction. So the more you want to quit, the more likely you are to try, and the less likely you are to succeed given that you try. Fortunately, the magnitude of the effect for trying is marginally bigger than the negative effect for succeeding, so there's a small net benefit, but a very small one. So why is it that something that you really want to do, you can't do it? It seems to me that it is the perfect definition for an addiction, something that you really try not to do and are unable to do. So there's something about smoking that's holding people, and I think it's largely because it actually has some pleasurable aspects for many people. Relapse can happen years after quitting. There are, around a third of people have made 6 months or more at some point and still have relapse. So people often relapse 2 or 3 years after they quit. It's a chronic relapsing condition similar to a lot of other drug addictions. I'm going to have to speed up. So can we do more? There's a whole lot more we can do on the conventional agenda. I won't go through all of these, but one of the things that we can add to the general agenda is the idea of substitutes. That if it's hard to get rid of something, then if you can substitute it for something else, it may make life a little easier. I now want to turn a little bit to theory, because I think theory is incredibly important. We need to have a coherent idea of how things fit together if we're actually going to try and understand where things are, and more importantly, make reason-based predictions about what's going to happen in the future. There are a whole lot of influences on behaviour. The point I want to make here, a thing that doesn't work, is that most of these external factors actually don't influence behaviour directly. They influence by affecting our beliefs and attitudes and by our habits. Whereas the things internal to us can influence our behaviour both through those pathways and also more directly. Trying to understand a problem as complex as tobacco, I think we need to be thinking more like the blind men and the elephant. You all know so I won't explain it. We're tending to look in isolated ways at various aspects of the problem, and we need to try and bring them all together. Just a little bit of a homily here. For these sciences, more than evidence, the evidence-based movement has lost track, in my view, of the importance of theory. Theory without evidence is pure speculation, but evidence without theory are unmitigated, unorganised facts. And we need to be drawing the two together better. We need some kind of comprehensive theory, and I just want to briefly introduce mine. I think I'll skip that slide. And I think the way in which we can bring the biopsycho aspects in with the social constructivist social determinist models is to actually explicitly adopt a dual process model of thinking. Dual process models of thinking basically suggest that we have what I call an executive system, which is our capacity for rational thought, and most importantly, from my perspective, the capacity to pursue linguistically defined goals. So we can actually set a goal for ourselves and pursue it, in comparison with what I call an operational system, other people call an impulsive system or a reactive system, which is the way in which we respond to the environment in the moment. this is an idea that goes back to antiquity. The Buddha used the analogy of the rider on the elephant. The rider is the executive and the operational system is the elephant. The rider cannot get what it wants without actually training the elephant to do it. You can't force the elephant. You can't act independently of the elephant. You've actually got to create the conditions by which the elephant wants to do what you want to do. And that's the challenge we have. We have our bodies telling us that we want to smoke if we're a smoker, the allure of things, and we have our rational selves telling us that this isn't a good idea, it's going to cause us long-term harm, and how do we reconcile those two? It's not just enough to change the social conditions. If the way in which we're feeling and responding to things isn't consistent, then we continue to have a challenge. Just a blatant plug for my book on this. One of the useful things that setting it up this way gives you is that if you plot the operational system and think of it as the desirability of doing something and the executive system as whether it's appropriate or not, there are some things where the executive system says, no, this is bad, and the operational system says, yes, I really want to do that. And they're hard to eliminate behaviours, like most of the addictions. On the other hand, there are things where the executive system says, this is a really good idea, but the operational system says, yeah, like going for a run at 6 o'clock every morning and other sorts of things that most of us aren't particularly good at, certainly myself. Different kinds of challenges. They're opposite kinds of challenges because the conflict is different. But this also tells us that most of the stuff we do, we just do. Our executive system and our operational system, for most of what we do, are pretty much in accord. We just do stuff. It's not conflicted. We don't tend to focus on it because it just happens and we do it. You don't have to actually spend a lot of time training most people to eat. I don't think anybody needs to be trained to breathe. There are some things we just do. So addiction is where there's a conflict between these two systems. And it requires some form of behaviour that overcomes these operational tendencies. And as I've said before, addictive behaviours are complex. There are positive reasons for engaging in an addiction. And an addiction only becomes non-fun when you want to stop it. Addictions are doing things that you actually enjoy doing them because they're fun until you decide that you really should stop, and then you find it extremely difficult. So the negative reasons, the withdrawal and the cravings associated with trying to control the behaviour are one of the things that keep you going. If that was all that kept you going, then anybody who got through the initial week or two of withdrawal should be on a smooth flight for the rest of their lives and left the addiction behind. But they're not. Most addicts manage to get through that stage and collapse back into it, as I said before. So a dual process model accepts that people vary in their the allure of nicotine. So some people are going to not try it and not like it at all. Other people are going to try it and take it or leave it. When tobacco was identified as harmful, the US Surgeon General's report, for example, there was a significant, clear decline by a couple of percentage points in the prevalence of smoking and a marked reduction in smoking consumption. There were some people who were doing it because they felt they had to. It was a socially acceptable thing to do. And finally they had a reason for saying no. But they're a minority. And they're the ones, it's easy for them to change. And they're the ones who think that quitting smoking is easy and that's some perverse thing about all the people who don't. The other thing about dual process models is it actually helps you to come to terms with the limits of human rationality and our capacity to be influenced in various ways. It accepts that there are roles for social disadvantage in that, and it also accepts that for the most addicted, successful quitting is going to be an extremely difficult task unless the person's life transforms. And something that you enjoy is difficult to give up, particularly if you've got nothing else much in your life that is enjoyable. So if you're out of work, family relationships broken up and all of the sorts of other things, smoking is your only pleasure, and it's not a particularly healthy one. So should we be looking more at the role of substitutes? Are there things that we can give to people for whom nicotine is an important part of their lives that doesn't actually involve just withdrawing something that was positive? So harm reduction for me is any strategy within public health that reduces the harm associated with something that isn't on a direct line to the ideal. And the ideal for smoking is probably, nobody ever uses nicotine, nobody ever uses any psychoactive substance. We're all totally self-actualizing people, and that's going to happen sometime next week. However, there's a lot of opposition to harm reduction, which I don't need to tell you people about, and I think it's most likely to happen where the strategies for harm reduction are perceived to be targeting factors that are likely to increase use, increase the initiation of use. So if it removes some of the barriers to initiation, then it's bad, because in principle, any harm reduction strategy should be associated with increased use of the product. If you take an economic balance, if the cost of doing something goes down, the likelihood of engaging in a behaviour goes up. So that's the dilemma that people face. So I probably don't need to tell you all of this. Combustion causes the vast majority of the harms associated with nicotine use. Nicotine itself is relatively benign. It's not been shown conclusively to cause any cancer, and this is based on the experience of Swedish snus. Snus is Swedish for snuff, and in the 1960s and 1970s, the then government-owned Swedish tobacco control monopoly, when smoking started getting a bum rap, decided to try and develop safer tobacco products. They found they couldn't do it for smoking, but they could remove most of the toxicants from the tobacco, so smokeless tobacco became largely reduced in toxicants. They could reduce the toxicants in the tobacco that you smoked as well, but then you lit the stuff up and created them all again, so it became an irrelevant. So you can't have a product that you partly combust and have a safe product is the basic thing. And so nicotine, heart disease, risk is a possibility. There is some evidence that people with acute heart disease are more likely to have subsequent problems and subsequently die from a heart attack if they continue to use Swedish snus, at least in one study. But there's no clear evidence that people who have ordinary hearts are at any risk. And in fact, just about any stimulant given to somebody with a very dicky heart is likely to be a risk factor. So whether it's a greater risk factor than other stimulants is unclear. I've just seen a systematic review that suggests that the risks in pregnancy associated with nicotine are probably exaggerated. There's very little evidence in a systematic review I've seen that hasn't been published yet, suggesting that there's not much evidence. I previously believed that there was quite a bit of evidence, but it doesn't appear to be particularly strong. So nicotine's a relatively benign drug. There may be some additional risks of lung ingestion, though. Our stomachs and our mouths are designed to deal with toxins. We put toxins into our bodies every day. They're contained in our foodstuff. Particularly if you eat organic fruit and veggies, you get higher levels of toxins because the natural defence mechanisms of the plants to protect themselves are trace toxins. Our bodies are really good at stripping these out and dealing with them. If they get too much of them, then they tend to break down. But in limited amounts, they're able to deal with them. But lungs were designed more for air and particularly sensitive to particles, solid particles that remain in the lungs. But vapourised nicotine has particles that go into your lung, but they're particles of liquids. They don't form solid particles. So in principle, they should be less dangerous. I just wanted to acknowledge that this is a contested area, that many people feel uncomfortable about the ideas of harm reduction. I admit to some of those feelings myself, particularly around the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry is probably the most evil people who've ever lived. Purely for money, they've killed tens of millions of people. You know, at least the Hitlers and Pol Pots of this world had some weird ideological beliefs behind their attempts to kill millions of people, whereas the tobacco industry just does it callously for no reason except for making a buck. So doing things that might help the tobacco industry is not something that I feel particularly good about, but I've been greatly informed by the Montreal protocols on CFCs, which many of you would all know about. But the really interesting thing about that is that the reason that piece of international law happened so quickly is because Monsanto and the other big petrochemical companies discovered that they owned the patents for all the CFCs, but then they discovered that they owned the patents for all the possible replacement products. So they were able to switch and gain huge political advantage because there was a no-loss game for them. So actually creating a situation where the tobacco industry isn't fighting us quite so hard actually has potential. So if we're going to do this, we need to do it in a systematic way. We can't just sort of say, okay, let's have some kind of substitute and see what happens. We run the risk of that happening in places slightly to the south of here, not mentioning names, where with their restrictions on the ability to restrict free speech or corporate speech, the potential for actually promoting products to a point where they're inappropriately used is rather great. You've all seen these devices, no doubt. They started in 2003. 2003, the first e-cigarette came on the market. That's only 13 years ago. Looked like a cigarette and had relatively poor nicotine delivery. These new devices deliver nicotine, some of them very effectively. Some of them, once you've learned to use them in a way, in levels which are comparable to those of cigarettes, but none I've seen that are quite achieve what a cigarette does. But they have some small fraction of the toxic chemicals in them. And of the ones that are there, they have some small fraction of the amount, except for the nicotine. So they're generally not delivering much in the way of toxins, but they are delivering nicotine moderately effectively, as yet not quite as effectively as a cigarette. but they are becoming popular, as the picture in the bottom might indicate. I think I don't need to say that for time. I accept that the long-term harms of these products will not be known for years. But what are the likely mechanisms by which there could be long-term harm? There isn't any plausible mechanism we know of which would suggest that the long-term harms could be anywhere near that of smoking cigarettes. Whether it's 5%, as Nutt et al. In an expert group that came together to get an estimate suggested, or even less is possible. A little bit more is possible, but a lot more seems implausible from all we know about the science of toxicology, which I admit to knowing not terribly much, but people who know more about it than me draw similar conclusions. There's already evidence from medium-term studies that there's recovery in lung function and various other things as compared with smoking. So as compared with smoking, your medium-term health improves. There isn't much in the way of studies showing whether that improvement is as much as you get from quitting altogether. But certainly there are benefits to be gained in the medium term. And in the short term, there are very few risks. There's a very small risk of batteries exploding, about the same chance as your iPhone exploding or any other battery-powered device. They were greater in the early stages because some of the early e-cigarettes, the vapors, started modifying the devices, and they started to be called mods because they drill holes in them and superpower them, and some of those led to accidents. But now the manufacturers are producing devices which do the things that these superpowered devices that were created in home workshops were able to do. So the risks are considerably low. Use is increasing. This is data from our International Tobacco Control Policy Evaluation Study. That's Canada in the red bar. The blue is the US, the greys, the UK, and the greens, Australia. And this is current use at any level. As you can see, it's been going up, and it's going up a bit slower in the countries with the restrictive environments, but it's still a lot of it going on. Now, of this use in Australia, and about 40% claim that they contain nicotine, about 30% say they don't, and 30% don't know. In the UK, it's about 70-some% say they contain nicotine. So there's quite a lot of use of these products without nicotine, even in a place where the nicotine is freely available. So when people talk about vaping, you really need to ask, are they vaping with nicotine or without nicotine? And it's very easy to ignore it. I've been working with a colleague on a paper, and it was only in the last draft of the paper that it suddenly occurred to me, because he put in some stuff about nicotine, and I checked the question, and I didn't know whether the vaping contained nicotine or not. So it's something that it's easy to ignore. People are using them more and more after their last quit smoking attempt. This is again ITC data in the UK, and this is replicated by Robert West's Smoking Toolkit study, where he follows people every month in the UK. A majority of quit attempts in the UK are now involve the use of electronic cigarettes. It's by far the most popular way of quitting, even though in the UK it is illegal to actively promote it as a smoking cessation aid, and it's still in some circles actively discouraged. So the consumers are speaking with their feet. This is what they're trying to use, and there are now, I think, over 1.5 million ex-smoking vapors in the UK. So, and I saw a week or so ago at least 2.5 million ex-smoking vapers in the US. Other things we're learning is that social acceptance of vaping increases with increased prevalence. People in the non-vaping people, at least smokers in the United Kingdom, are more favourable to vaping than non-vaping smokers in Australia, for example. And if you ask people if they know people who vape, the more people they know who vape, the more likely they are to be to treat it as socially acceptable. So it's not one of those things that as you get close to it, you say, ugh. It's one of those things as you get close to it, you say, oh, it's nowhere near as bad as I thought it was going to be. However, the bad news is that there's increasing belief in most of the countries where we've looked that more and more people think these products are either more harmful or as harmful as smoking. Something that, as I've said before, is that almost vanishingly unlikely. And I think that's because there has been some systematic distortion of the evidence by people who are against vaping. And I think that's potentially a major threat to public health. If people believe these products are as harmful, then why would you use them? They're not quite as good as a cigarette in terms of the delivery device. If you think they're as harmful or even more harmful than smoking, why would you use them? So they're actively discouraging people from moving to a harm-reduced product. Now, the harm-reduced products we have at the moment are pretty clean. The ECOS product I mentioned at the start is actually much more dirty than the others. I'm running out of time. No. It's much cleaner than cigarettes, but it's closer to e-cigarettes than cigarettes. But and Philip Morris are now spending billions of dollars promoting it. And as a tobacco product, it's going to be available in a lot more places. And with Philip Morris behind it, we may end up with people using their product and making a lot of money rather than these products, which are largely a consumer-driven movement rather than something driven by the tobacco industry. And people are confused. We've done some qualitative work because of this increased sense of harm. People are confused. They think, for example, that because they've heard that taking stuff into your lungs is dangerous, therefore because vaping takes stuff into your lungs, vaping must be more dangerous. And because vaping's not as attractive as smoking, it must even be worse than smoking because it doesn't give you any good and gives you all the same bad. So overall, it's not as desirable an activity. So people are confused. I'll skip that. That was just to say that WHO, in their preamble to their constitution, argue that the consumer has to be part of public health, and the vapers groups don't seem to be consumers. They're excluded. Yeah, they're excluded. But most people in tobacco control refuse to talk to the vaping groups because they seem to be stooges of the tobacco industry, which is absolutely not the case. Now, I've been going on far too long. I apologise. Important point. The risks of vapourised nicotine, the better it is as a way of getting people off smoking, the more likely it is that young people are going to take it up. So if it's really successful at getting people off smoking and is low in harm, it will be successful because it is a pleasurable thing to do. And if it's a pleasurable thing to do and relatively low in harm, young people are going to be interested in doing it. So this is the major concern of most of the anti-vaping groups, is that it will lead to increased use. It will lead to increased use of vaping. There's already little bits of evidence that may be happening. It's almost inevitable. If it doesn't, it will mean that it's probably not going to be a solution to smoking and we can forget about it. But I think we've passed that time. Part of the reason for this is vaping is somewhere on the way to not smoking, but it's still up in the positive quadrant of operational achievability, if you like. And so it's a bit like on a ladder. People fear that if you're on the ladder and get to there, then it makes it easier to smoke. Now, in principle, it does. If you learn to use nicotine, in principle, it might make it easier. But why would people want to go that little bit higher when there's a huge amount of extra risk for a very small amount of benefit? Most people are rational in their behaviour and try to be rational as much as they can. Sometimes they fail, but it's not for want of trying usually. So people are trying to get off the ladder of smoking, giving them some rungs that they can move down stably is an easy thing for them to do. Yes, it would be easy for them to go back, but why would they want to go back? And most smokers don't want to go back. Most of the people who take up vaping do not return to smoking unless they find vaping is not good enough. I think we've done that. The next question I think we ask is, can it be stopped? I think it's unlikely. It's now a multi-billion-dollar industry around the world, and even if you made it illegal, the experience of illicit drugs in various other places suggests that making something illegal doesn't actually stop people using. Marijuana, for example, I believe is used more in BC than tobacco.
In the rest of the world. Yeah.
And I believe it's still technically illegal. So making things illegal doesn't actually stop people wanting to do them if they're interested in doing them. So I think we have three options available to us. We can manage it as a public health issue. We can let the commercial interests decide. Or we can leave it to a dynamic between prohibition and the black market. I think the one of those is likely to maximise the public health benefits if we embrace it and try and manage it in the interest of public health. The commercial interests are interested in money, and where money and public health conflict, money will win. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be, in some cases, partnering with them. In some cases, we may have to partner with parts of the industry, but we need to have a strong public health voice in the argument. I will go on. I've been going on for far too long. Just very briefly, I've talked about the benefits. I've talked about the potential downside, which is the uptake by adolescents. But again, adolescents will take up vaping if they find it attractive. They're unlikely to transition onto smoking. Why would you transition onto smoking if vaping does it for you? Because if the kids are choosing not to smoke now and give up all of that thing, if they're getting half of it, why would they not be able to resist smoking? I don't think it makes sense. However, we should be prohibiting sales to minors. Minors shouldn't be exposed to psychoactive substances while their brains are developing, and as far as we can help it, until we understand more about the way in which these products influence the developing brain. We should restrict advertising for products that people have a limited capacity to control themselves. We should be removing the incentives to actually create the environment where people want to do more than they would naturally do. There's a cost associated with every time you see an advertisement for something you don't want to do. You've actually got to spend some time resisting the urge.
We forget that cost, and it's a significant cost to the community. Any parent will tell you the cost associated with restricting their kids from doing some of the things they don't want to do because they've seen ads and promotions for those sorts of things. It can be extremely costly in terms of time and effort. Dual use is another issue where people are concerned. There's quite a lot of it happening at the moment, but the evidence is increasingly showing, and all of our theory is telling us, that it's likely to be a transitional thing. Most people have a preferred form of use of any particular drug, and they tend to gravitate towards it. This is likely to happen for vaping, and this seems to be what's happening in the UK. In the US, there was a decline in the number of smokers who were vaping, but a major increase in the number of ex-smokers who were vaping. It suggests that unlike the nicotine replacement model, where you use it for 8 weeks as you quit and then stop using it, that the vaping transition model is a more gradual one. It takes people a year or two, perhaps, before they can wean themselves completely off cigarettes. So I think dual use isn't going to be a problem, particularly if we continue to inform people that dual use isn't in their long-term health interests. I was going to
Ron, I was just wondering if you could maybe close.
Yes, I'm sorry.
We have time for questions if people want to stay.
I was going to talk about regulation, but I've run out of that. I'll just go to the conclusions. I think these products are potentially a transformational technology. They're changing the way in which we think about smoking. As I said, the potential and risks are correlated, and like it or not, they're here to stay. We can manage them, as I said, to get their benefits. I don't think at the moment they're potent enough to work unassisted. They're not going to transform the world, particularly when half of the public health community are fighting against them. If they were that good, the fight would be over because they would be unstoppable. And as I said at the start, I think that the only current prospect we have for effectively eliminating smoked tobacco, and I think that within 10 years, if we embraced electronic cigarettes, we could be at a point where we could effectively eliminate the use of smoked tobacco. These products can be delivered to people at a similar or cheaper price than smoking. They're giving much of what smoking gives, and they're not taking 2/3 of people's lives away from them 10 years prematurely. Thank you. I'm sorry for going on.